Unsolved.
Zodiac killer case, the Raccoon Hunters. The time frame for the murder of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen is pretty set because James Owen left his house sometime just before 11, and so he would arrive at the turnout approximately 11:11, give or take a minute or so. And on that end, Homer and Peggy Yore were there after 11, and Peggy saw David and Betty twice, traveling west, and then when they turned around and coming back east. And the Raccoon Hunters were out there at that time. So even without James Owen's testimony, the crime could not have happened much earlier than 11:11 p.m. And then on the other end, at 11:15, when Stella saw them lying on the road, that's almost set because she drove to Benicia to the gas station and spoke to the police, and that time is recorded as 11:19. And the police arrived at 11:22. So you can't move that 11:15 time either. And so here's a map of the area again, and I added a couple of things. It looks like the Gasser Ranch, you could either exit Lake Herman Road and get to it, or you could exit off Highway 21. And then Stella Borghi's ranch was on both sides of the Lake Herman Road, but I guess the house that Stella was in, the witness Stella was in, was on the south side, 2.7 miles west of the crime scene. So here's the timeline that I kind of created for that night. And the conclusion that I draw is that the Zodiac killer must have came in from the east, or it's much more likely. Because if he was traveling from Vallejo towards the crime scene, he would have had even less time to commit the murders. Because Stella left her house at 11:10. So the Zodiac killer would have had to pass Stella's house prior to that time. And then James Owen is traveling east on Lake Herman Road. So he would have been directly behind him. And so James said he didn't see any car other than a car that passed him in the opposite direction. So the Zodiac had to be several minutes ahead of James' car if he was traveling from Vallejo, because he would have had to pull off at the turnout and park and possibly get out of the car before James even gets there. So it's more likely that the Zodiac killer was driving west on Lake Herman Road when he saw David's Rambler and he pulled in next to him. And when he left, it seems more likely that he would have headed east on Lake Herman Road. So these facts have led me to the conclusion that possibly Robert Michael Cannelli or Frank Gasser or a friend of theirs committed the murder, and they lied to the police. Keep in mind that the police went to them. They didn't go to the police. So here is Robert Cannelli's police report. This is what the police officer wrote. And he was following up on a previous report because he found inconsistencies in his first statement. And first, what I want to mention is, just because it's in a police report doesn't mean that everything is correct. For example, Robert's name. In the police report, it's spelled Connley, I believe, which is obviously incorrect. Second, it says that he was in his red pickup truck. I don't believe that's true. I believe they were in Frank Gasser's pickup truck because he was a farmer, and so that's why he had that truck. And Robert didn't have a truck like that. All right. In this, I want to point out 3 things where I believe Robert was lying to the police. And the first is, he insists that the Rambler was parked on the bank. The reason that he lied about this is it makes it seem like he didn't commit the crime because he's saying the Rambler was not in the location where the police found it. Second, it says that he stayed at the Gasser Ranch for an hour or so. I think that was a lie. I think he left immediately after they returned. They were in Frank's truck. They drove to the ranch, and Robert got in his car and left. And the third thing is, Robert mentions that he left out through Highway 21. So why did he make that distinction? He could have left out Lake Herman Road, which would have put him closer to the crime scene. But he told the police that he left out through Highway 21, not on Lake Herman Road. And then he said he headed north and then west towards Napa through Jameson Canyon on Highway 12. So now I'm going to tell you about Frank Gasser, who was born on March 10th, 1900. And so he was forced to register for World War II. And he filled out this card here. And it shows that he lived at 332 North Springs Road. And so I'll go over that in a second. And then on the back, it gives a physical description of him. And he was only 5'6". He weighed 150 pounds. His eyes were blue and his hair was red. But here's the house, 332 North Springs Road, that he lived in during the 1940s. And you can see here with this map that it's only a few blocks down the street from where the phone call was placed after the murder of Darlene Ferrin on July 4th. And here's Frank Gasser's death notice when he died in November of 1971, just a few years after the crimes. And you can see it says that he was an avid hunter and sportsman. So now some information about Robert Bob Connelly. Now he was from the Richmond, California area. And so this is a photograph of him in high school. And so far I haven't been able to find out how tall he was or how much he weighed. But his father filled out a registration card for World War II, and it shows that he worked for Standard Oil at Point Richmond, and on the back that he was 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighed 195 pounds. In 1957, the family moved to the San Rafael area, and that's where Robert graduated from high school. And it's also where he met his future wife. And so here's the notice in the paper about him obtaining his marriage license to Christine Doris Gorman. And here you can see that he was in the United States Navy, stationed in San Diego in 1961 and probably 62. In the 1967 Vallejo City Directory, you can see that he worked for PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, and he lived at 1019 Hargis Avenue. And now I looked in the 1966 directory, and he wasn't in it. Now this leads me to his address at the time of the crime. And I believe he lived at 1088 First Avenue in Napa. But I can't find any record of his name at that address, or anybody's name at that address. But what we do know is Robert was living in Vallejo. He moved, and then about a year later, this crime happened when he lived in Napa. And the phone call placed after the Lake Berryessa crime was placed in Napa. And he had served in the United States Navy. He was 10 years older than David Faraday, and he wore the same hairstyle as Mike described in the murder of Darlene Ferrin at Blue Rock Springs Park on July 4th. And most likely, he was the same height as his father, 5'10". So the big question is, how much did he weigh at this time after being out of the Navy 5 years or so? Was he barrel-chested? Was he heavy-set? So in the next episode of the Zodiac Killer case, I'm going to either follow up on Robert Michael Connelly some more with more information, or I'm going to look into someone that I found, his friend. And here's a side-by-side view of his friend when he was in high school in 1959 compared to the sketch of the Zodiac killer or suspect out at Lake Berryessa. And so you have to keep in mind there's a 10-year difference here. And then also I have this side-by-side sketch of another person compared to the sketch of the San Francisco suspect. And again, this is a difference of 15 years. When he was in high school in 54 and the sketch done in 69. Well, this ends this episode of Unsolved, and I'm kind of hopeful. I learned several things here. I'm interested in Robert Connelly, and I also found this friend of his a neighbor, and I'll follow up on. And that it seems like the Zodiac killer came in from the east. So, like, for example, Paul Duerre lived in Fairfield, but he worked in Vallejo. So he could have driven south on the 21, exited Lake Herman Road, and went to work. And one night he decided to carry out this crime, so he would come down, exit Lake Herman Road, commit the crime, and then head east and out. And then the second time, at the July 4th, he did the same thing basically, came down, exited, and he would be familiar with the newspapers in Vallejo and San Francisco because of his job in Vallejo. So anyway, I'll see you next weekend.